Do you struggle with the constant need to fidget, inability to concentrate, or acting impulsively? These are just three of many symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
At GeneScan, we have devised a new SNP chip genetic test for ADHD. In today's presentation, our marketing team will go through a variety of components one should consider prior to participating in our SNP chip genetic test.
ADHD is a behavioral disorder that interferes with daily activities, characterized by having a short attention span, hyperactivity, and a lack of impulse control. Those with hyperactivity may talk nonstop, interrupt others, be impatient waiting their turn, or feel restless. Diagnosis of ADHD requires a comprehensive evaluation by a licensed clinician. In order to receive an ADHD diagnosis, the symptoms must be chronic, impair the person's functioning, and cause the person to fall behind typical development for his or her age. ADHD is not just a childhood disorder. It is commonly treated with medication, education, or training, therapy, or a combination of treatments. The genes that are linked to the development of ADHD are typically connected to the development of the brain. Scientists have shown that there are differences in the brains of children with ADHD that change as the child becomes older. Within those with ADHD, the frontal lobe may mature a few years later. Proteins created from the affecting genes often hinder growth, production, and organization of neurons. Other research has also found low levels of dopamine in those with ADHD that can lead to changes in thought, behavior, and motivation. There's consistent evidence of association between ADHD and dopamine receptor genes. Even so, linkage studies suggest that there are no genes of moderate effect size, and findings from large-scale whole genome association studies are currently awaited. The continual examination of gene-environment interplay is critical in learning more about ADHD risk factors. When addressing what causes this condition, one can look at multiple factors pulling from the genetics and environmental conditions in an individual. Multiple variations have been observed to contribute to causation of this disease. Along with genes, risk factors include cigarette smoking, alcohol use, or drug use during pregnancy. Exposure to environmental toxins such as high levels of lead at a young age, low birth weight, and brain injuries are other possible factors. Many of the changes in genes that are involved in the development of ADHD are unknown. The continual examination of gene environment interplay is critical in learning more about these risk factors. It is about finding out the best possible ways to confound these factors to properly treat those who struggle with ADHD each day.
The DNA SNP chip test should have approximately 16 DNA variations of ADHD genes. However, our company's test is searching for specific variations in the BDNF and SNAP25 genes. The BDNF gene provides instructions for making a protein that's found in the brain and spinal cord called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The presence of a polymorphism within this gene function can result in differences in brain motor system function, as well as altered short-term plasticity, which is the ability for the brain to grow and reorganize thoughts and processes, according to Snipedia. The likelihood of someone receiving this variation of the trait is on the stronger side, since the allele pairs AG and AA will result in this genetic variation. This process is generally expressed by a multicellular eukaryotic cell which contain a nucleus. This protein, when functioning normally, would typically promote the survival of nerve cells by playing a role in the growth and maturation of nerve cells. The variation within the protein makes it difficult for the cell to efficiently carry out these tasks, which results in disorders such as ADHD.
The genetic test that we have created is beneficial at being able to protect ADHD. This genetic test finds variations of BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The specific gene variation is RS7265. The allele AG creates an increased risk of ADHD, which is also associated with that gene. The allele combination AA would make it more likely to develop impaired motor skills. 2 out of the 3 allele combinations would result in issues in relation to ADHD. These variations in the SNP would result in development of ADHD, which affects 20 to 60% of cases continued from childhood. This part of the test would be beneficial because it would help young adults determine if their ADHD would continue into adulthood, develop during adulthood, or possibly determine the risk of developing into another condition like Alzheimer's. The SNP RS27072 is also being tested for. RS27072 is a dopamine transporter gene that is often associated with ADHD. The allele pair TT has a lower risk of developing ADHD. The allele CT has a lower probability of developing, but a chance of developing ADHD. Allele CC has an increased probability of developing ADHD. ADHD is possible in all these allele pairs. Having the allele pair CC created the highest risk of developing ADHD.
The next component of our test that you may want to consider before participating is the limitations of our SNP chip test for ADHD. You might be thinking, what can't this test do? And to be honest with you, there are some limitations, but not that many. The 2 primary limitations of this test are its variety and accuracy. In the realm of variety, SNP chip tests do not detect all differences in chromosomes or DNA. In terms of accuracy, the SNP chip test can produce false genetic variant detection. A positive test may not be fully predictive for ADHD, and a failed test may not be able to rule out the trait completely.
When it comes to the SNP chip test, there are other ethical aspects that one must take into consideration before deciding if they want to begin the testing process or not. For instance, the price of a genetic test such as this can be very costly, and the results of these tests can have negative effects on the subject's emotional and social interactions. Certain genetics tests can range from hundreds of dollars to a few $1,000s, which the majority of people don't have lying around. Testing positive for some sort of genetic disorder can lead to feelings of hopelessness, loneliness, and depression, which can be very taxing on the subject in question. Both the emotional and financial components of this kind of genetic test are important to take into consideration before deciding if the subject should continue.
Here we have our evidence and references listed. Thank you for your time today, and we hope that you've gained more knowledge about our SNP chip test for ADHD, and that you'll be able to confidently put your trust and future in the hands of our team here at GeneScan.